In 1958, 12 nations signed a treaty that made one continent permanently off-limits to private citizens. Not restricted, not regulated. Off-limits, you cannot book a flight and land wherever you choose. You cannot dock a boat on most of its coastline. Researchers require government sponsorship and multilateral approval. Journalists require escorts. The only continent on Earth with no indigenous population, no sovereign government, and no commercial economy is also the most legally protected landmass in human history. I spent months trying to understand why. What I found wasn't about climate science. It wasn't about military strategy. It was about a city. And once I understood what kind of city it might be, I understood why the treaty was written the way it was. I came to this through maps, specifically a 1513 map drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. The map is held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It is not disputed. It is not a reproduction. It shows the coastline of Antarctica with accuracy that should be impossible, because Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. 3 centuries before European explorers reached the continent, Piri Reis drew its northern coastline in detail. The Turkish Naval Museum has verified its authenticity. The Library of Congress holds photographic records of it. This map exists, and it shows something else. It shows the coastline as it appears under the ice that has covered Antarctica for an estimated 12 to 17 million years. Piri Reis didn't draw a frozen wasteland. He drew land. The standard explanation is that he compiled the map from earlier source documents, ancient charts that no longer exist. Scholars accept this. What they don't ask is who made those earlier charts, and why the civilization capable of mapping an ice-free Antarctic coastline left no other trace in the official historical record. There is a name that researchers working outside mainstream academia use for this missing civilization: Tartaria, or the Tartarian Empire. The academic consensus dismisses the term entirely. Wikipedia describes Tartary as a historical geographic term for a region spanning Central Asia and Siberia, not an empire, not a unified civilization. But the dismissal itself is interesting, because the maps don't cooperate. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, European cartographers produced hundreds of maps labelling a vast territory, stretching from Eastern Europe through Siberia to the Pacific as Tartaria Magna, or Great Tartary. The 1688 edition of the French Atlas Historique shows it as the largest nation on Earth by land area. It appears in Britannica's first edition, published 1771, with a description that treats it as a functioning geopolitical entity. Then, within a few decades, it disappears. Not conquered, not divided, not renamed. It simply stops appearing on maps. The cartographers stop labelling it, the historians stop mentioning it. I want to be careful here because this is where the research splits. One interpretation is mundane. Tartary was always a loose geographic descriptor, never a real political entity, and European mapmakers simply became more precise over time. The other interpretation is harder to dismiss than it should be, that Tartaria was a real civilization with a real capital, that the capital was destroyed or buried, and that the erasure from maps was deliberate. What I cannot reconcile with the mundane explanation is the architecture. In cities across North America, Russia, and Europe, there exists a category of building that historians attribute to the mid to late 19th century, but which shows construction techniques that don't align with documented capabilities of that era. The old post office in Washington, D.C., completed in 1899. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, constructed for the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. The Chicago World's Fair buildings of 1893, most of which were demolished within years of completion. The St. Louis Union Station opened 1894. These buildings share something beyond their appearance. They share a style that researchers call Tartarian architecture. Massive arched windows, geometric precision, facades that require stone-cutting technology not documented in manufacturing records of the period. The demolitions are what pull at me. The Chicago World's Fair, known as the White City, drew 27 million visitors, a number equivalent to roughly half the American population in 1893. The buildings were described by contemporaries as the most magnificent constructed in human history. Nearly all of them were demolished between 1894 and 1896. The official reason was fire risk from temporary construction materials. But the photographs contradict this. The buildings do not look temporary, they look permanent, and the stone doesn't burn. There is a researcher named Sylvie Ivanova who documented what she calls the mud flood theory, the hypothesis that a catastrophic event in the early to mid-19th century buried the ground floors of buildings across the world, and that the official architectural and demographic records of that period were constructed afterward to fill the gap. I am not endorsing this theory. I am noting that the evidence she cites, the half-buried building entrances visible in photographs across Russia, the first floor windows that open at ground level because the original ground level was lower, the census gaps in the 1800s where entire cities appear in records with no documented founding event. These things exist in the photographs. The photographs are real. The gaps in the founding records are real. Which brings me back to Antarctica. In 1947, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump. It was the largest Antarctic expedition in history at that time. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 men. The official purpose was to establish the research station Ye Little America 4 and train military personnel for cold weather operations. The operation was planned for 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. Admiral Richard Byrd, who commanded the expedition, gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper in March 1947 in which he described encountering aircraft during the expedition that flew pole to pole at incredible speeds, technology that didn't belong to any known nation. The interview was reported in El Mercurio. Byrd's quotes have been reproduced in multiple academic citations. The early withdrawal has never been officially explained. The Antarctic Treaty was signed 11 years later, in 1959, entering into force in 1961. 12 original signatories: Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Article 7 of the treaty grants observers from any signatory nation the right to inspect any station, installation, or equipment in Antarctica. It does not grant the same right to private citizens, journalists, or independent researchers. The inspection rights exist between governments. The exclusion applies to everyone else. By 2023, 56 nations had signed the Antarctic Treaty. Not one of them has ever formally proposed opening the continent to independent civilian exploration. Not one has submitted legislation to allow private archaeological survey. The scientific stations that do operate there are funded by governments and staffed by approved researchers. Their findings are published in peer-reviewed journals vetted before release. The continent is not secret. The access is. I need to acknowledge what I might be doing here. I might be connecting events that have no real connection. The Piri Reis map might be accurately explained by ancient maritime traditions we haven't fully reconstructed yet. The Tartarian buildings might reflect a style that was genuinely popular in the 19th century and produced by skilled craftsmen whose techniques were simply better documented in practice than in surviving records. Operation High Jump's early withdrawal might have a mundane explanation that simply wasn't publicized because military operations frequently are not. The Antarctic Treaty might be a genuine response to Cold War territorial competition. Nothing more. But here is what I cannot explain away. The ice beneath Antarctica is not uniform. Ground-penetrating radar surveys published by the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany and referenced in Nature Geoscience have detected subglacial features beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet that include what researchers describe as ancient river valleys, lake systems, and geologic formations consistent with sustained habitation-level temperatures at some point in geological history. The surveys do not claim to have found a city. They claim to have found the terrain that, in other parts of the world, would be where we look for one. The Lake Vostok discovery made this concrete. Lake Vostok is a freshwater lake the size of Lake Ontario, located roughly 4 kilometers beneath the Antarctic ice surface. It was confirmed by Russian researchers in 1996, though the existence of subglacial lakes had been theorized since the 1970s. The lake maintains liquid water at temperatures around -3 degrees Celsius, kept liquid by geothermal heat and the pressure of the ice above. It has been isolated from the surface for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. Russian researchers drilled into it in 2012. What they found has been released in fragments: thermophilic bacteria, organic material. The full data set from the 2012 drilling has not been published in its entirety. This is confirmed. The Russian Antarctic expedition's own communications acknowledge ongoing analysis. After more than a decade, the complete findings from a lake that may be the most scientifically significant discovery of the century have not been made public. I keep returning to the question of why a civilization capable of mapping Antarctica before the ice would have built there. And the answer, if you accept the premise, is obvious. Before the ice, Antarctica was temperate. The geological record supports this. Fossils of tropical plants and cold-blooded reptiles have been found in Antarctic sediment layers. The continent wasn't always frozen. Something changed. And as civilization advanced enough to accurately chart coastlines across the globe in the 15th century using source documents of unknown origin, was almost certainly advanced enough to recognize that a catastrophic climate event was coming, and to build accordingly, meaning deep, meaning permanent, meaning underground. The Tartarian architectural signature that researchers point to most often is not the facades, it is the foundations. Buildings attributed to the Tartarian style are consistently documented as having foundation depths and construction densities far exceeding what structural necessity required at the time of their documented construction. You don't build a foundation 40 feet deep for a 3-story building unless you expect something to come down from above, or unless the building was meant to survive something that the builders knew was coming. The Antarctic Treaty contains a clause that has received almost no public discussion. Article 5 prohibits nuclear explosions and radioactive waste disposal in Antarctica. The prohibition made sense in 1959 as a Cold War safeguard. It makes less sense as a permanent restriction on a continent with no population to protect, unless the concern wasn't fallout travelling outward from Antarctica, but something else travelling inward. Something beneath the ice that a nuclear detonation might disturb. I don't have a conclusion. I have a pattern. A civilization that doesn't appear in the official record, but appears on every European map for 200 years, then disappears. Buildings attributed to the 19th century that show construction signatures we can't replicate with documented 19th century technology. A continent that was charted accurately 3 centuries before its official discovery. A naval expedition that left 8 weeks into a 6-month mission, and whose commander described things he saw that no one has ever officially addressed. A treaty that protects a continent with no population more rigorously than most populated nations protect their borders. A subglacial lake with findings that haven't been released after more than a decade. And under all of it, under 4 kilometers of ice, a terrain that looks, on radar, like the kind of ground where, in every other part of the world, we find what people left behind. The Piri Reis map is in Istanbul. You can look it up. The Antarctic Treaty is a public document. You can read it. The Alfred Wegener Institute's subglacial surveys are in peer-reviewed journals. The Lake Vostok drilling report exists. The gap in the published findings exists. The buildings in Chicago were demolished. The photographs of them remain. The pattern was there before I found it. It will be there after this video ends. And the ice will still be covering whatever is underneath it, the same way it has been, the same way the treaty ensures it will continue to be, for as long as anyone with the authority to change that decides it shouldn't be changed. The chair my grandmother left me still sits level. Someone built it to last. Someone always builds things to last when they know what's coming. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The question is why we were told it didn't.